this is Todd. If you're wondering, boy, it looks like he's recording in a basement. Ha! I am. But I'm recording this after Thanksgiving, so happy Thanksgiving, everybody. I wanted to use this video to talk about Sandbox play. In essence, what is it? Do you even want it? Then maybe a few, tips and tricks, ideas for using it. So the first things first, let's just talk about what is a sandbox. I think it is one of those topics that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, not necessarily on the large part, but when you get into the nitty-gritty. I've been trying to think for a while exactly how I can define it to make sense for what I'm going to talk about and not get too much into the weeds on things that ultimately I don't think are fair and necessary comparisons. A lot of people will say, it's sandbox versus railroading or sandbox versus this, and yes, ultimately there are different philosophies, but I think they're a lot more alike and have a lot more in common, and often there's a lot more overlap than people may want to give it. And this is not one of those I'm going to yell at the top of my voice and scream about how sandboxes are awesome, or this stinks, or this is amazing. I really just want to kind of stay grounded, keep a level head, and just go through some of these things. And hopefully it will make sense whether you're playing 5th edition or whether you're playing an OSR game, whether you're playing any kind of game. What I came up with as far as definitions go was that in a sandbox, in that game space, the players have ultimate freedom of movement and interaction. What do I mean by those things? Well, let's take freedom of movement. They can go where they want to go, or not go where they don't want to go, right? When we think about sandbox as open world, oftentimes that's what people are saying. Oh, it's an open world, meaning you get up at the inn, you have the town, you can go east, west, north, south, whichever way you can go. There's nothing binding you to going only in one direction or only in another direction. I mean, clearly there might be hazards or obstacles, but there's no invisible rail saying, oh, no, you can't go south, right? You can only go northeast, right? There's none of that. You can go any direction you want to go, you can go. And by freedom of interaction, it's mostly the same. In this case, though, we're talking about the players have the freedom to take on a task or not take on a task or any other particular action as they see fit. There is not a quest objective that they must do. If they are in the town and the farmer comes up and says, help, help, rats have taken over my basement, in a sandbox type game or in a sandbox type situation, the players would feel empowered if they don't want to go fight rats today to say, no thanks, I'm not going to do that. Whereas in, I'll call it a more narrative campaign, and again, I do feel like there's something we're going to have kind of sandbox on one side, narrative on the other side, but there is a lot of overlap, and there is a lot there, so it's not quite so simple as it may sound. But in a narrative campaign where we understand that that's what we are supposed to do, that is step one down this road of objectives, we would feel, okay, we'll go take care of the rats and see what comes from that. But we're in a sandbox situation, we might feel, say, hey, I don't want to kill rats today. Sorry, guy, you go get somebody else. I want to sit in the tavern, or I want to head out of town, or I want to check out those caves, or whatever I want to do. So that's how I would define a sandbox. And please, as with anything, feel free to leave in the comments wherever you find it, here on YouTube, elsewhere, depending on how you are ingesting this content. Let me know how you would define a sandbox. But that is my basic, broad definition. I mentioned narrative before. When I think of a narrative campaign, I think of one with a set of goals towards a particular end. And that is that narrative. But like I said, there's a lot of overlap. I'm just going to use an example that I know pretty well, Lord of the Rings. If we think of the narrative in the Lord of the Rings, it's the fellowship or the individuals, or you can start with the hobbits, depending on who you want your player party to be, to destroy the ring in Mount Doom. So what are the steps that might be along that way? The first step is, if we're starting in Hobbiton, it's get to Bree. Second step, get to Rivendell. third step is really just to get to Mount Doom. But even just in talking about that, you might think, okay, yeah, that's a narrative campaign, but there's a lot of sandbox in there, because getting from any one of those steps, we can look at it and say, Middle Earth is wide open. You're going from Hobbiton to Bree. There's different ways to get there. And in fact, the hobbits have to change course a couple of times down the way they're going because of the hazards they run into. They might want to go this way, they can't because of the ring race, so they have to go another way. Different adventures happen, right? They end up, kind of going through this countryside and going through different things. That might not have been the choice. That might not have been when they were plotting it out in Hobbiton how they wanted to go, but the world, the effects, just their ideas came in, and so they ended up taking that path. So that element, that's a sandbox, open world. Same thing, once they leave Rivendell, they know that their goal is to get to Mount Doom, but the party gets split, they want to go this way, and bad things happen, so they go another way, worse things happen, they end up in, Lothlorien, and then they're, other things are going on, and so they decide to, some of them go one way, some of them go the other way, right? They go, Frodo and Sam try to go the most direct route. Doesn't look very good. They use their wisdom, their better, their judgment, say, no, we're going to go around this other way. Other things are happening, right? So, you have this narrative, but there are all these sandbox elements. So, is the Lord of the Rings, if you're going to play that as a campaign, is that a sandbox campaign or is it a narrative campaign? Well, it's kind of both. And I think a lot of people have those elements in their game. I think practically speaking, in a sandbox, there's at least one narrative. If I was to then say, well, what's the difference between the sandbox and the narrative campaign? I might say that regardless of other features or anything else going on, a narrative at the top of the chain has this narrative. In Lord of the Rings, there is one overarching narrative that carries over everything else, and that is the War of the Ring. A sandbox campaign, I would say maybe at its base, or either the top or the bottom, depending on how you want to look at it, has no single overarching narrative. There might be a ton of other narratives, and I think often in sandbox campaigns in play, there are multiple narratives going on, but not one of them is overarching. There is no singular War of the Ring that everything is about. Instead, there are multiple things happening in the world. To make an example of maybe one like that, we might talk about, the good, the bad, and the ugly comes to mind. Not that it doesn't have a narrative, because it does, but if you look at, as they're traversing the world, going on their little adventures, they're running into things like the Civil War, and they're running into each other, and all these kind of things are happening. It's almost a set of vignettes that are happening around these other elements in the world, but not one of those world elements is really what it's about, right? The war is happening, but it's not about the war. They're just passing through. They could take part in it if they want to, or they could bypass it. It's kind of hard to find it in fiction, because fiction is generally going to have some kind of narrative. You could probably look at bits and pieces of Game of Thrones and different parts of seasons. I never read the books. I couldn't get into the first one, so I just kind of stayed away from them. But looking at the books, there were definitely, or the series, there were definitely, I don't know if a whole season, but there were some number of the shows took place where it was hard to find out what that overarching plot was, or was very removed, in which it seemed like all these characters are kind of doing stuff, and then you had sort of world events coming in and out, right? Those world events are different narratives. What's happening in Marine versus what's going on, in Westeros, and all these different things are happening, and then characters are kind of picking and choosing. So in that element, you might say, okay, well, in that way, it seems like a sandbox, even though in the way, way background, there maybe is an overarching plot, which I guess is the rise of the, what's his name, the Ice King? I don't know. Whatever it is, somebody can let me know if they know. So, in a practical sense, there's probably going to be an awful lot of overlap between narrative and your sandbox. But you might think of ultimately what has primacy, what is the prime thing. In Lord of the Rings, right, in a narrative story, it is that narrative. There is some overarching narrative that is ultimately primal, even though there might be lots of sandbox elements and an open world and all these other things. When you look at it, you might say, oh, that's a sandbox. If you pull out far enough, you'll see that arch of the narrative. In a sandbox, you'll probably see multiple arches, maybe a whole bunch of arches. When you pull out, what's most clear is that overall play area, the sandbox. So And I think when you go online, you get in discussions, because the waters are so muddy, you'll find a lot of that, making it harder to really dig into either one of those play types, because so often it becomes this thing of either butting heads, oh, narrative, oh, sandbox, right, like that, or, oh, I'm running a pure sandbox. No, you're not running a pure sandbox. You have narrative elements, or I don't run pure sandbox. I start out with a sandbox, end up in a narrative. Oh, what's this? Well, all that stuff is great, and there's nothing wrong with any of it. They're all good, but it makes it hard to talk about one of those particular things. Even in a very linear campaign, you might find elements of sandbox in there. It's probably not going to be completely linear. I can't even imagine what it would be like to be linear without any kind of sandbox play. Because if you think about it, your average dungeon is a sandbox. You may have a linear goal at the end of it. Rescue the princess, rescue the prince, find and defeat the bad lieutenant down at the bottom, find the piece of treasure, the piece of the rod of 7 parts, whatever it is, or just move through to the other side. But in that dungeon space, between the entrance and whatever the climactic room is, you basically have freedom of movement and freedom of interaction. There might be puzzles and things that depend, but a lot of times really you can go where you want to go, do what you want to do in there. So even though you might have this block that's in a part of a line of blocks that forms this linear pathway, inside that block you can bounce around however you like. That's kind of a little sandbox inside of a more or less linear experience. So do you want sandbox? I think a lot of people in their mind, in their brain, I see this often online, there's, I don't know, it's almost like there's like a magical effect, a mystical effect that the word sandbox gives to people. Like it's very, very romantic in a role-playing game. It's sandbox. Like we can do whatever we want. We can do, we can go wherever. Oh, it's amazing. We can explore the world. And that's fine. That's great. I do love that element, and I can see that how that romantic notion could take hold of you and stay there. The problem is it's a lot of work. If you are a GM that likes to have everything super plotted out and know where everything's going, a sandbox is going to seem like a nightmare to you, because you have to have this wide open nature. You have to sit there and say, well, yeah, they could go north, west, east, south, whatever, so what do I do? If I feel like I need to know everything about everything, what's the limit? What can I safely not prep? Do I have to prep everything? Do I have to prep? How many hexes do I have to have ready? How many towns do I have to have written up? How many NPCs do I have, depending on what they're going to do? That can be overwhelming if that's the way you prep. And I'm not even saying it's a wrong way to prep. I've always said about prep, hey, prep the way you need to. Don't listen to the people on the internet. I think there's a little bit of, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of a self-congratulatory tone. I improv 99% of the work. I prep nothing. That's wonderful. That doesn't work for everybody. Heck, I don't even know, this is all the internet. I don't know their games. I don't even know that it's working that well for them just because they post it in a forum. So I don't put any great stake into that. You have to prep for what you're comfortable with. And for some people, a sandbox is not going to give you that kind of comfort. It's a lot easier if you say, okay, look, I know where things are going. I know they're going from Hobbiton to Bree, so I'm going to have this map, and I'll know, okay, from Hobbiton here, Bree over there, and I'm going to plot this stuff along the way, and you're, again, always making sure that your party, your table is in on it, and they know. Because I don't want to have to plot out, well, what if they go to Mickle Delving, and what if they decide to turn around and run to the Grey Havens instead, or what if they decide to call the Eagles and try to Uber their way to Mount Doom, whatever it is, right? I don't want to have to deal with that. From a player standpoint, a lot of players can get lost in a sandbox. I think it's something that's not really mentioned a lot, but in terms of momentum and giving them a push and giving them a clear goal, narrative really provides that. Sandbox, I've said to the players when I started my game, like, look, you're gonna have to be kind of self-motivated. You're gonna have to figure out or decide what your character wants and be able to do that. Because if you can't, you're gonna stare at that sandbox and you're gonna wait for me to give you something. And now I'm happy to do that, but then that does make it a little bit less of a sandbox, not in a great way, but if I'm starting to throw quests in front of you and I'm laying down that narrative for you, right? So if your idea of that freedom is great, but there can be that maybe analysis paralysis would be the right way to put it, like they talk about in board games. You have so many choices that you can't make a decision. That is a real problem. You might not think you have that, or you might not think you would succumb to that, but you can. It happens to everyone. It's happened to me, and sometimes, frankly, the world is partly at fault. If the GM doesn't give you enough information, doesn't give you enough materials, doesn't give you enough things to do, we talk about, people will talk about the fact that just giving choices without context and without any way to weigh those choices is like having no choice at all. If you come to a hallway and it branches off in two ways and there's no way to differentiate between them and there's nothing, then which one do you choose? How do you know? If you're in the middle of the desert, which way do you go? If there's no, you look to the one direction, nope, all I see is desert. You look at the other direction, all I see is desert. You spin around, you say, all I see is desert. Well, which way do you go? I don't know. I don't know where the sea is. I don't know where water might be. I have no idea of anything. How am I supposed to make that choice? Either I'll just pick randomly or I just might sit there and say, I don't know, right? So even though Sandbox has a romantic notion, I think, on both sides of the screen, the reality is it's not always as fulfilling as you might imagine. Either you or your players. So you've heard potentially the pluses, the minuses, the challenges, maybe some of the benefits, and you've decided, hey, I still want to do this. I like what you're selling me, Sandbox. It's for me. So how do we go and start it? Well, that's the easy thing. All you have to do is really talk to your group about it. Now, I think it's important when you're talking to your group about running a Sandbox style experience that you are extremely clear about what it is. Not just in terms of, hey, this is what I or somebody else said about it, but what you really think it is and what it entails for you. Because one of the issues you can run into, regardless of what kind of game you're running, is a miscommunication between you and the other people at your table. And obviously this is true whether you are the GM or you are a player. Someone says, oh, hey, I want to run a Sandbox game, table of 5 people, maybe each one has a slightly different idea of what that means to them. So don't be afraid to define it as much as possible, as much minutia, as much detail, as much specificity as you can. What does that sandbox mean to you? Where are you going to be, generally speaking, if we're taking a spectrum from a purely narrative, there's essentially one plot that's driving things forward, to on the other hand, maybe there are no narratives, or at least no larger narratives, only small narratives we're going to be creating, or somewhere in between. However you envision it taking place, really lay it out to them, because the worst thing is if you get in a situation where you've started playing, you've started planning, you've started running games, and the party is doing things one way because of their understanding of the game, and you're thinking they're going to do something else because of your understanding of the game. And that kind of conflict is going to lead probably to you as a GM being unhappy, the players being unhappy, or both. But that being said, once you've explained it to them and they all give the thumbs up and they say, yeah, we're down for that, boss, let's do it, great. Then you don't really have to do anything else other than start doing all the prep work, whatever you need to do to make that sandbox happen. If they say it's not for us, well, then your choices are come up with a compromise that works for both of you, or put together a group that was willing to play through the sandbox that you want. But that's the easy part, right? You lay it out there on the table, you get a thumbs up or the thumbs down, and you handle either one of those appropriately. On to some techniques, tips, and tricks. One thing that I like to do is, I mentioned before how there is a real analysis paralysis issue that can come up. You drop people into the ye old town, and without giving them any kind of purpose, asking them, hey, what do? You could end up with a lot of people going, What do I do? What do I do? Is there an inn? I guess I'll go to the inn. Oh, is there a job board? Can I go look at the job board? Is there a merchant I can go see? Is someone in the street yelling that they need adventures or something? Right, you're going to get a bunch of people looking for that plot hook. Where do we go from here? So one thing you could do is give them that direction from the get-go. I like to give parties some kind of occupation or job to start them off. Think of it as the shallow end, the steps leading in the deep end of the pool. Now, I don't particularly care after the start whether they decide to keep with that occupation or job or whatever it is I've given them, or decide to branch out and go into business for themselves, do whatever. But the idea behind giving them an initial something to do is to exactly avoid this issue of them not knowing what to do, them potentially not being unified on what they should do, and having party members, 5, each one deciding to go do something else. So if you know, hey, you got to get the message to old man in the hills, then everyone's going to be on this path saying, okay, we got to find the hills, find the old man, hand them the message. I usually like to be more like that. I usually like to give them more like a job as opposed to one mission. But the idea here is giving them a job or mission does a couple things. It gives them a chance to get their feet wet, get the lay of the land. I'm not someone who's going to I'm going to hand you a campaign Bible with 100 pages on everything about the 8 kingdoms that are here and all this stuff. I'm not going to do that. So the players are really going to be relying on me, particularly the first, to set the table, give them all the details to the world, let them know what's going on, and rather than give them all that in a dump or make it uncomfortable, in an info dump, by the way, not other kinds of dumps, rather than try to give them all once or some other way, I can give them a job that's going to kind of let them interact with the world, let them get their feet wet, let them get a sense of what's going on, and then once they have that sense, let them loose. If you can find players who are just going to take a little paragraph, if you can give them an elevator pitch, hey, this is the Wild Wild West, you're in essentially Dodge City, go, and they say, okay, great, I'm going to become a gambler, and I'm going to go look for gold, and I'm going to try to find the Lost Dutchman mine. Awesome. But a lot of players may need a little bit of help with that, and of course, it's easier if you're doing like a Wild Wild West, or in fantasy terms, if you're doing a more or less a medieval landscape that they're familiar with, but the more off the beaten track you go, the more away from those stereotypical settings that you go to, the more difficult it will be for players to get their feet wet. If you're doing something that's totally alien and it's great, but it's very unique and different, then as a player, I might say, well, I'm going to need some time to figure out what's going on. And this is where you can help them do that. So you give them something to do. You give them that little, you might talk about, some people say, well, I'll use a sandbox and narrow it into a funnel that's going to be a narrative. Well, here's the case, maybe you're doing a narrative that's going to funnel out into the sandbox. Maybe allows them the ability to get some contacts up front, even make some enemies, give them a way to earn some cash depending on what kind of game you're playing. I usually like to do that, give them a way of making some money, at least some ideas, before they decide to go out looking for treasure. Just gives them a way to get involved and feel like they kind of know something and have something to do, because oftentimes you can get good to get direction. I would say as another thing, tip, trick, technique, don't be afraid to sort of give them a smaller area to work with. I see this sometimes where people will say, oh, I don't know what happened to my party. They went to the port. Oh my gosh, they decided to board a boat for the other continent. Oh, what am I going to do now? They're sailing off to another continent. Okay. You can put some kind of, I don't want to even say limits, because depending on what kind of world you're working in, in medieval times, boats just didn't leave when people showed up. It took months and months and months for boats to get ready. They didn't just kind of come and go like ferries across, certainly not across, transoceanic voyages. These things took a lot of time to set up, to prep. They didn't leave on a schedule. So I look at it and say, look, you get to the port, you're looking for a boat. Yeah, the boat's going to be leaving in 3 months. It's fall and the seas are rough and we're not leaving, or we're waiting for this other caravan to arrive, and when that gets here weeks and weeks from now, we're leaving. you don't have to gift wrap options. I'm not shutting the players down because it is a realistic thing, or realistic, right? You can imagine it. You can put aside and say, yeah, I get that. I get that. So on the one hand, maybe you say, well, on a meta level tide, you're really just putting up barriers, invisible barriers. And yeah, maybe I wouldn't say I'm putting up a barrier. Yeah, I'm making it a little bit difficult. If they have their heart set on sitting in town for months waiting for this boat, great. Now they got to figure out how they're going to maybe raise the money to earn passage on this boat when it leaves. What are they going to do for the month's room and board? There's a lot of adventuring that could happen there in between those times. But I'm not putting up artificial obstacles. It's not an invisible barrier like in Time Bandits when they get to the edge of the evil guy's thing, and it's just like a mirror wall that they just slam into. It makes sense. By the same token, in other parts of the campaign, maybe you set them in an area that's got some natural boundaries that might take some time and effort and resources to get around. Let's say you put them in a valley that has mountains around them and the passes are mostly closed for a lot of the year. You have to wait till the high summer, let's say, for the snows to melt enough to get across. And if you start at the, say, winter into spring, that gives you a couple months. If they want to leave and explore the rest, great, but they've got to figure out how to wait, or they got to figure out some other ways to do it, but they can't just jet through. I don't feel like you have to make it easy for them, particularly if it's, I think sometimes GMs will make it unrealistically easy. Now, sometimes this is part of your setting. You have airships. They want to get an airship ride. Do you give it to them? Do you don't? I don't know, but you don't have to just gift wrap to this. Certainly, especially if it's going to throw everything off. I think it's okay to say, on a meta level, I'm going to try to keep them in this area. This thing that I have, this is my sandbox right now, and then as we're growing, I'll increase the sandbox. I'm not going to make it impossible to go around. I'm not going to put up invisible walls, but I'm going to put up some difficulty. I'm going to say, okay, well, to get out of this particular area, maybe you need to hire a boat. And to hire a boat is going to be 5,000 gold pieces or silver pieces. So now go earn yourself 5,000 silver pieces. And if you can do that by hook or by crook, hey, you're going to get on the boat. I think that's reasonable. I don't think that is too difficult, but it gives me some time to prepare. It gives them some idea of, I think it even adds to the understanding the scope of your world. If it's very easy to travel across the map and everything, then the world's going to feel kind of small. But if it's going to take months and months for boats to come and come back, or the seasons are important, and what's in the spring and the summer and the winter, those changes to the landscape, if they mean something, I feel like that just adds to the flavor and the character. So I don't look at it as a bad thing. But I guess what I'm saying is ultimately, find the sandbox size that you're comfortable with, and think of how you can make it so that it's that size is not only you're comfortable with, but that it's reasonable. I guess that ultimately is what I'm saying, is that it's reasonable. It's not reasonable if you put your city out in the middle of an open plain, or your town, and the players can't ever leave. You're kind of always inventing reasons why they can't leave the town because you want them to stay in town. That is not reasonable, right? But if you put them in a town and the town is under siege, that's reasonable. That's interesting. It makes for interesting choices. They want to get out of the city. Great. How do you do it when they're surrounded on all sides? They can come up with plans to do it. There might be things happening in town that they could help. I don't think that that's unreasonable. I think that is a reasonable thing, and that is a really interesting situation. But the point is that if they can find a way to get around this obstacle, get over it, under, you're going to let them. You're not going to artificially then put something else. Oh, you made it outside the siege. Oh, there happens to be the dragon that's there. Oh, behind the dragon, Tarask is circling. Something like that. It gets goofy. But ultimately, you got to find the size of the sandbox that works for you, that you can make reasonable for your table without them feeling the constrictions, because there are always some edges to your sandbox somewhere. Even if it's all the plains, there's at some point you're saying, there's no further plains here. All those plains are all the plains and you can't get across. Or you don't have plains. You're saying, this is a prime material campaign. I'm taking all those plain spells. Well, then that's your limit. Or we're saying, hey, we're in this continent. This is all about, I did a campaign like that for a while. It was, hey, you're exploring this new continent. hint, hint, like the continent's kind of where you're supposed to be. Can you go home? Sure, but that's not really where you're supposed to be. This is the sandbox, the continent. You could make the sandbox some other area. You have to do it in a way that people can use their imagination to justify and make sense, as opposed to it feeling completely arbitrary and completely meta, because it breaks not only does it break the illusion, but it makes it hard as a player to plan around it, because then you're just thinking, well, I could try this, but is that going to work, or am I just going to run up against an invisible boundary? Whereas if it's something that's in the fiction, well, I could try to just run out through the gate and just keep running and hope that the army sieging me doesn't capture me. Well, yeah, sure, its chances of success are really low. Do you really want to try it? No, I got to figure something else out. But in that way, I'm still thinking I can figure it out. If it's just an invisible wall, there's nothing for me to figure. That's it. I'm stuck. I'm trying to think what other techniques or tips. Those are the ones that were on the top of my head. If you have tips or tricks or techniques that you like to use, feel free to throw them in the comments, shoot them to me in an email or on Twitter or wherever you can find me. I'd appreciate it. Just keeping in mind, I think, just to wrap up, right? We're talking about sandboxes, and a sandbox, to me anyway, is when you're in a game place, a game state, in which you have freedom of movement and freedom of interaction, and that includes the negatives: freedom not to move, freedom not to interact. When you're in that kind of environment, you are in a sandbox. Right? When you think of a narrative, you're thinking of a more or less, you're looking at chaining events together that lead towards a particular conclusion, or at least theoretical conclusion, or conclusions, depending on how branching and how much is going on. You could have levels of sandbox and narrative stacked on top. I think of a sandbox as if you zoom out all the way out and you look at it, it looks like a sandbox. And some of them, it's a sandbox, but you zoom all the way out, it might seem like there is an overarching single narrative that everything is a piece of. I think of Lord of the Rings in that way. There's a lot of sandbox elements in the Lord of the Rings, but if you zoom out far enough, the dominating feature is the War of the Ring. Why might you, what downsides are there, or why might you not want to use a sandbox? It could be your players have analysis paralysis issues that can definitely come up. You have to be, I think, have a lot of self-motivation as players to really make a sandbox work. As a GM, there's going to be the onus of a lot of prep, whether you're preparing everything in advance, whether you're doing it off the cuff in an improv style. You have to be ready to do a lot of that to make it work. And then, some tips, tricks, and techniques. Try to keep the sandbox to a size that you're comfortable with, but make it make it make sense in the fiction. Make things, if you're going to put barriers on them, make them barriers that make sense. I think in sort of part and parcel with doing that is you don't have to gift wrap options to your players that are going to break out of your sandbox, but you shouldn't necessarily make them impossible either. You got to look and try to find that kind of realism that might work. You don't have to just gift wrap every option to them because you feel like you're in a sandbox and you have to. If some modes of transport are more difficult. I used an example of like a transoceanic ship voyage that might be, the boats doing it are very rare and you have to wait months for them to show up. Could also be extremely expensive. Might even be seasonal on top of it, but you could also look something like, hey, teleportation circles, right? But you have to wait until you get the spell at whatever level to get the spell. And that way, some locations that you can only get to through teleportation circles are effectively gated until you reach that level. That could be something similar. It makes sense in the world. We all know, oh, okay, I need to be 4th level for that spell. I don't know what level it really is, but whatever. Then as a player, I have a goal. I want to use teleportation circle because I want to use those circles to go into this funky place. I got to get to 4th level to do it. Now let me figure out how to get to 4th level. That's the kind of thinking I think you want in terms of, your players. And I would also just say as a caution, no one game style is better than another. It's all going to be how you execute it. This is not the magic thing of, oh, it's a sandbox, therefore it's great. It's better than a narrative because it's a sandbox. Or no, none of that is true. The quality of the campaign is going to come from the work that you and your players put into it. Whether it's a sandbox, whether it's a narrative. I've seen sandboxes do great. I've seen them fall flat. I've seen narratives be great. I've seen narrative fall flat. I've seen a whole bunch of different things. There is no magic bullet. There is no magic technique. whichever path you choose, if you choose to create a sandbox, you're gonna have to put in the work to make that sandbox an interesting, compelling place to play, and then you have to find the players who will be interested and compelled and really want to play. But if you can do all that, then I think it is a great experience. And if you have listened to all of this and you think like, man, I'm really jazzed up to do it, then I hope you do so and let me know how it goes. Until then, I will talk to you next time. Game on. I'm out. Next